Gina Dent is an associate professor of feminist studies, history of consciousness, and legal studies at UC Santa Cruz in California. Erica Meiners is a professor of education and women's gender and sexuality studies at Northeastern Illinois University. Gina and Erica are two of the four creators of a pivotal new book from Haymarket entitled Abolition Feminism Now. It's an essential text that was also co-written by Angela Davis and Beth Ritchie, two of the most important thinkers on the prison industrial complex and its deep connections to racial capitalism. Abolition Feminism Now is a breathtaking invitation to enter into a conversation about how we might respond as a society to the dehumanizing and brutal system of policing and punishment that we've more or less come to accept as the only means of ensuring public safety. Rich with examples of strategies for liberation, this book offers an authoritative analysis of not only the forgotten place of the incarcerated in contemporary society, but many, many other timely social problems that feel at times like they have no solution. The trick is, they say, the solutions are hard to imagine because of the way that ideology and what they call carceral aesthetics blind us to the urgent necessity of abolition. In this conversation, I tentatively asked Gina and Erica whether there might be a way for abolition to become more insistent on proactive change rather than only emerging in response to particular crises. Their response reminded me of how little I really know about the movement for abolition. This is not about some historically new force in global politics. It's not the case that abolition feminism right now represents some reactionary emergence of something that wasn't there. Abolition feminism has been here for a very, very long time. It's just that this history has been purposefully and perniciously forgotten. This moment of increased mobilization that we're seeing today is the product of what Gina calls a widening of the circle, to include people that have been awakened by recent events and who are trying to respond to multiple temporalities coexisting at once. They suggest that striking back against the normalizing of state violence requires the work of pushing the public's sense of what the prison industrial complex is past the specific space of unfreedom we imagine, the prison, and insisting on having longer and more complex conversations about the system of racist mass incarceration that we inhabit and that we're complicit in. That's a lot to take in, but it's necessary, they argue, to stay with the complexity, with the trouble. As they write in Abolition Feminism Now, it feels like historical time is accelerating. Crises are escalating and crashing violently onto the poor and precarious, so we have to try to respond with radical solutions to the emergencies that envelop the vulnerable first, while also remembering that, as they try to explain, we are always going to struggle to learn when we're in the space of emergency because of the suffocating intensity of emergency. This is a problem if the goal and challenge of our times is no less than to fundamentally rework the very way in which society is structured. It might be time to extol the value of radical independent journalism that fights back against pro-police misinformation. It might be the time to politicize pop culture too. We discuss how many people separate the knowledge they glean from popular culture from the knowledge they acquire from more serious sources. But the thing is, the pop cultural knowledge is still serious, considering the fact that Kendrick Lamar and Dr. Dre were just reportedly pressured by the NFL, which is currently embroiled in accusations that the league is run like a, quote, plantation. They reportedly asked them not to spout messages that are negative towards the police during the Super Bowl 56 halftime show, a longtime spectacle of American nationalism and militarism. While Dr. Dre kept his anti-cop line in his song, much of social media reacted right away when they heard Lamar omit a reference to the police in his anthemic song, All Right. This omission, whether Lamar was pressured or not by the NFL, defangs a song that became a rallying cry at certain points during the uprising for Black Lives. This strategic censorship matters, and in this conversation, Gina and Erica offer some powerful ways of theorizing the consequences of cultural revolution that makes previously censored thoughts, statements, and rallying cries unsayable. The kind of first thing I wanted to throw at you grew out of my viewing of last week's online book launch for Abolition Feminism Now, which, by the way, everyone should check out on Haymarket Books' YouTube channel. Gina, you talked about in that book launch, you talked about how mutual support provided a kind of framework for writing the book. And there was also a moment toward the end of the launch where Angela admitted that she kind of doubted whether all four of you would be able to assemble a unified voice, given, everybody's distinct identities and critical voices. But what was amazing to me is that, Angela also says that because of, rather than despite those differences, she learned more from this book, she says, than any other she's been involved in, which kind of blew me away. It reminded me of the moment in the book where you all write that, quote, building radical community can be contagious and joyous work. There's a way in which I think the book is sort of modeling how to create a unified but still plural voice. So I'm wondering what you would say that you learned, I suppose, about, working through and with difference, as Angela sort of put it. And I think relatedly, how you overcame, your stated dissatisfaction with the technologies that were available for collective writing. I mean, any practical tips on collaboration and on maybe fighting Zoom fatigue are more than welcome.
So I guess I'll begin since you raised my name. Thank you for having us and for your engagement with the book. We're so very happy about it, and really, from my perspective, it's mostly because it is a collaborative effort and because it represents not only our collaboration, the four of us, but the collaboration of so many who've been working over so many years. And so I think we definitely both underestimated in the beginning how disparate our takes would be, and we really hadn't factored in what our written language would look like. And after so many years of knowing each other and interacting and sharing a political vantage point, we expected that to be able to do the work of guiding us. Now, as experienced organizers, we probably should have understood that that's not how it works, and that our brief timeline for producing this manuscript was overly optimistic. But we certainly did learn a lot about what it means also to be marginalized in other areas and then to try to come together and put our ideas and the ideas of those we wanted to lift up at the center. And that process was really, really important. We started on Zoom before Zoom became the norm. I happened to have an account from another project, and we thought that it would be a bridge until we could be in person together writing all day, just spending time enjoying meals and discussing. And while in many ways I would have preferred that modality, we managed to enjoy our time on Zoom, and we used our weekly check-ins and work to talk about what was happening in the world. And so I do also feel that I learned so much in this process. I learned so much about the material and the histories, but I also learned so much about the other authors and the different ways in which we can access very similar ideas and what it takes to explain those to each other and to explain them to our readers.
That's amazing. Erica, did you want to follow up on that?
Oh, sure. First, it was just great to be in conversation, and I was just listening to Gina, and I was like, yes, sort of excited by hearing your voice. Yeah, I just was remembering when we started. It was, I was in a little tiny cubbyhole in New York, and I think I had never used Zoom before, and so it was just sort of like, what is this new technology that I'm going to be trying? I think. I feel like there's so much, like the world when we started this, is so different than the world that we're in now. I think that's one lens, but it's so much is also the same. But what the sort of the last several years of working on this, I feel like it was a incredible and very powerful anchor, given all the shifting and unfolding this changes in working conditions, changes in the political world, changes in health and pandemic anxieties. So for me, it was also just like really a wonderful anchor to have this project. And I think we all, were juggling multiple, life commitments, organizing commitments, paid work commitments. So it felt, it did feel sort of precarious at moments. Like, are we going to be able to move through this and finish the project? I mean, I think that, the relationships and the learning and the connections absolutely, I think, solidified, grew, anchored. But I mean, the turning something into a product, that has an external life was, absolutely a challenge. And I think even having it floating out in the world, I mean, we all are like super excited and thrilled, but we're also, I mean, I look at it and I think, oh my gosh, we missed talking about such and such project,
Right.
which is like, how could we forget, so-and-so's work, right? So I think there's maybe that's just me, my anxiety, but I have that little worrisome. But I feel like also, I think it's something that you said earlier, Gina, that it's actually much easier to have this, to be talking about this project in the world, because I think that there's like a shared ownership of the work between the four of us, but also a shared ownership of the work much more broadly. So I think that is feels right and feels useful.
Right. And the book describes itself as that sort of invitation. It doesn't imagine that it's, tying things up by any means. But yeah, it must feel good to have it out there, but also to have this sense that it's not sort of just an embodiment of one person's thinking. Like it's like a movement document, maybe more so. And it must feel good not only for you, but I have to say, it feels good for the rest of us who sort of needed that book. I read an interview with artist and scholar activist Cyrus Marcus Ware recently, where he talks about how, quote, there isn't necessarily a place to get all the info about basically theories and practices of abolition. In part, he thinks, quote, because we've spent so many years having to debate about why abolition, that we haven't necessarily had as much time to be able to dream about how abolition. Now, though, he says, it's just a different conversation. Abolition feminism now is offered, as I say, as this kind of invitation, an open-ended intervention. There's, like, for example, there's a number of places where you're actually signaling to the reader that this is a small book that doesn't necessarily contain all the answers. I think about, like, Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete, which is also, like, notably a short book. Even though you're acknowledging that there are sort of these omissions, Erica, do you feel like that was on some level a conscious effort to keep the text manageable so that it could be maybe more easily added to and operationalized? Like, did you learn that tactic from other movement documents that you talk about in the book?
I mean, I think it's like a both and, great question. Both, I think we were fairly clear that we weren't, and we sort of articulated that in the project, that we weren't trying to have it, any finite, complete, authoritative genealogy or kind of prescriptive checklist. So I feel like that was sort of central to our thinking and our writing and our practice. I think, but at the same time, this is the sort of the both and. It felt important because of our relationships, our connections, and our our practices to try to be as generous in how we were what we were including. And so I think that that's sort of a tension, and also a productive tension to sort of be clear that we're not trying to do a finite project, but also recognizing that it also matters what's included and what's not included, and how to hold that tension in a productive way and in a generous way, and in a in a way that's invitational, so that this project can be in conversation with as the person you were citing before earlier framed, with other pieces that are emerging now. I think that there is, more texts that are coming out that are both kind of looking historically, but and also more in the doing, in the how-to around abolitionist work. And I think that's wonderful and amazing.
Yeah, I mean, Patrisse Cullors just released an abolitionist handbook that has these, like, questions, these prompts put into it that are, incredibly probing questions, like what would it mean to allow yourself to feel more in relationship to prisons? Gina, did you want to follow up on that thread?
Well, one thing that we were aware of is how these movements do or don't get documented. And the problem of thinking about leaders and then looking for certain kinds of activity to represent ideas and activity that has gone on before. And we were really wanting to make sure that we could create this open container that would allow people in the future to be able to go back and understand some of these interconnections and know the names of some of these organizations and be inspired by them.
Mm.
And also, we felt that the people who are out organizing now needed to be able to be recognized and to see themselves in this, and also to see themselves in larger companies. So one of the things we spent some time doing was thinking about what the parameters were for abolition feminism. And that meant that we included work that didn't go under the label abolition feminism. In fact, almost none of it does. And work that would be maybe a different approach than we might take individually and even collectively as authors. And yet we felt that all of that work was contributing to this shifting and evolving environment where these questions can now be taken up in a serious way. And some part of it needs to be that practical component. This is also really about feminism, a feminism which recognizes all of the small and large labors that go into making change. We talked at some point, I think, about, what our theory of change was. And while we don't narrate things in that way, I think we are indicating something about how we think about history, how we think about the future, how we have come to recognize that movements can take advantage of that forward and backward looking. And so I think we're sharing the joy of this moment, even as we are all facing, and of course, as recently as the new case in Minneapolis area, we're facing ongoing death and ongoing destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. The video is horrifying, and again, like I mean, the context is missing, it seems, and that's what your book, to some extent, is offering. It's offering more than that, and I want to come back to this idea that it's also kind of theorizing temporality itself, like the temporality of transformation in a
Mm-hmm.
way. But like right now, there has been this widely reported on spike in crime across the U.S. and globally,
Mm-hmm.
and the book is sort of trying to give people a different way of thinking, more fundamentally, more radically about what we call crime. And like the reporting on crime that you get from the mainstream news really doesn't offer any structural engagement with the sources of the spike per se. Like it's maybe gestural, and like it causes a panic in certain
Mm-hmm.
parts of basically white settler culture, I would say, and like just a familiar demand to basically hammer criminals by throwing more policing at the problem. So like for example, Jeff Greenfield just appeared on PBS NewsHour to talk about how, from his perspective as a white settler, crime is an unavoidable, he calls it a thermostat for public opinion. And like they even present him with this problem of how activists who are demanding criminal justice reform, at the very least, what they should do in this moment. And of course, he has little to say because he doesn't really have much sympathy, clearly, for what he no doubt takes to be a kind of lost cause. And all they talk about is how the new DA of Manhattan got elected on a progressive platform and has to now deal with the fact that there is only room for reform, and I
Mm-hmm.
guess by extension, I suppose, only ever an appetite for abolition in moments where crime is decreasing. And like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the time, I think that ramped up policing is in direct response to like invocations of the unsafe children who live in underserved communities, maybe especially, but not exclusively. And like here, I think, like Erica, I wanted to maybe bring in your research on the child, the figure of the child, and what Lee Edelman calls like reproductive futurism. The child should be symbolic of a not yet determined future. But like your book, For the Children, Protecting Innocence in a Carceral State, is a serious takedown of this notion that the child is representative of possible futures. Like you argue, materially speaking, really the child is when we're talking about the child as vulnerable, it's usually a white child, and the trope of innocence gets deployed to usually like foreclose on any sort of radical structural change. You're saying children matter, but it also matters ideologically that, quote, it is never precisely clear who counts as a child or a youth, and that in some inescapable way, the child is being employed to protect what you call the punitive matrix of a carceral nation. And I guess, like, thinking about your book, how do you see that being used right now, if at all? Like, is there a way in which the pandemic maybe has shifted, like, the discourse on the grievability of certain young people and their families and maybe not others? Or is it like the same dead end that it's always been politically?
Wow. Okay. Thanks for that fabulous question. I mean, I'm both, always, slightly optimistic and not at the same time, not to invoke the both and again. I do feel like, for example, I'm here in Illinois and state of Illinois, and the governor is moving to close the last 5, juvenile prisons in the state, but is also, proposing a new multi-million-dollar, treatment center for young people. And there's a lot of public, sympathy for closing down the last 5 juvenile prisons in the state. But we've had like zero public sympathy for releasing anybody in prison during the COVID pandemic. So I think the question that you're asking, it's always the both and. We did have, during the moment of the pandemic, more attention to the conditions for people inside. And we had mobilizations, caravans, as we talk about in the project, around prisons and jails, pushing for release. I know in Canada, I was just, talking to folks in Canada, and Nova Scotia released, 41% of their prison population. Granted, it's fairly small during the COVID pandemic, and no consequences in terms of backlash. So I think that the question that you're raising about, has the pandemic altered the landscape of grievability? From where I sit, I would argue no. I mean, we couldn't get into prisons and jails. We couldn't get into them. Hand sanitizer, there's not potable water in the one that I'm often in pre-pandemic, and even a couple of times during the pandemic. So I think that the limits of who counted as fully human, right, which is an old question, a persistent question, right? It doesn't extend to people locked up, even in this moment of COVID, right?
But the next one again sort of references your brilliant book, For the Children ? In that book, I like that you write about the effects of what you call problematic representations in visual culture of like harmed white girls, dangerous strangers, police saviors, and violent criminals and convicts. You make it clear in the book that those are images that, quote, solidify stereotypes and reinforce affective political investments in a carceral state, and that it's less often the case that you can find media representations that challenge audiences to rethink common sense surrounding punishment. But like, there is this sense that counter memory is important as a means of contesting and correcting these affective political investments. In Abolition Feminism now, there's also this important appeal for what you call an anti-carceral aesthetics that can expand our ability to like visualize the violence of the carceral system. This is really to both of you, but I guess like, could you speak to your sense in For the Children and both of you to your kind of co-authored book that there's something about the terrain of pop culture, especially that, as you put it in the book, kind of outpaces changes in policy and law. Like there's a different kind of potentiality in pop culture that I get the sense you don't feel is being realized.
I mean, I think of it less in terms of a problem of temporality, in terms of popular culture catching up. I actually think about it in terms of how we, in movements and in academia and in popular life, um, artificially segregate or attempt to segregate the knowledge that we receive from our visual cultural environment and the knowledge that we receive from our own experiences and from our friendships and relationships, and the knowledge that we maybe read about or consume in other ways. I think we like to assume, especially as academics, that we understand incarceration because of what we've read about it, or a documentary, or even legal work or organizing. But we have to acknowledge the degree to which we are also informed by this pervasive environment, which represents incarceration as having always been with us, at least visually, because we have no filmic history without it, and always pressing on us. And so the proliferation of images of Law and Order, and to say Law and Order, I can even invoke the series, the multiple series by that name, which are which had inundated not only U.S. culture but are shared globally. So that information is working on us all the time. I actually have to say that I watch a good deal of popular culture as part of my work. Sometimes that's horrifying, but I have really noticed the degree to which a wide spectrum of films, television programs, and other offerings have started to try and transform at least an idea of what happens once someone goes into prison. I mean, one of the things about police procedurals is that they begin with a case, and then once someone is rendered into custody, you no longer know what's happening. They just disappear, and we're not invited to think about it. When we do have exposure to issues of incarceration in our popular culture, we have certain tropes that are returned to again and again, especially when we're talking about women in prison. And so the emphasis on the violence of those who are incarcerated rather than the emphasis on the violence of the system is something that all of us have been exposed to relentlessly. And as I was beginning to say, I do see this being challenged in a way, in small ways now. People like Patrisse Cullors, whom you named, and others have taken an interest actually in the production of television, partly to address some of this. People like Mariam Cabo, who are interested in looking at children's books, have tried to address the various ways in which young people are introduced to ideas about justice, and even just how we should live. And so I think of this as really challenging us to attend to the ways in which we are shaped by this as knowledge, and that these contributions need to be thought of in terms of how they contribute in subtle ways, in ways that we're often very unaware of, to our delimited imagination. And that certainly weaves back to what you said a moment ago about the crime spike. Many people are blaming the crime spike on the defund the police movement.
Right.
But
Course.
We need to talk about the conditions under COVID that have exacerbated racial capitalism and have exposed so many of the fissures in our society and so many of the problems of not having a safety net. Popular culture could be a space in which we start to generate different kinds of narratives about what we can do, but we have to be concerned about it. We have to think beyond just freedom of expression, which has meant that the controlling ideology has determined so much about what is produced and what is allowed to appear on our screens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to kind of think about there. I don't know, Erica, if you wanted to add to that at all.
Sure. I mean, I think the question about the crime spikes, there's been a lot, of independent, journalists who've been sort of challenging that, doing kind of deep dives into research and really kind of, problematizing that, those, facts. So I think that's an important thing to pay attention to, and just another moment to lift up radical, independent, journalists. I think really important. And then I was just, while Gina was talking, I was just flashing because yesterday I was talking to two students I teach at a working class, pretty open access public university here in Chicago. I teach sometimes in the Justice Studies program. I was talking to two young men of color who are in justice studies, and were telling me they are interested in being parole officers, but in order to be parole officers in Illinois, you have to first have worked in corrections, have been at like a CO, a prison guard. And so I was just, kind of like asking them about like, did you wake up at 13 and want to be a parole officer, parole agent? And Illinois also doesn't actually have parole, so it's a longer conversation, but essentially doing the work of a parole agent. And they were talking about television shows that they'd watched, right? To Catch a Predator, Locked Up, a couple of other ones. And it was this sort of like, first in their family to go to college, wanting a job that is hiring, right? But, corrections is always hiring, right? Wanting a job that had like authority, respect, leadership, compensation, and of course, how teaching, for example, or is portrayed in the mainstream media in Chicago is like, they're firing Black teachers right, left, and center. It's sort of all societal evils are the result of public school teachers. So I was just flashing on their, I did, highlighting TV shows that they had watched as sort of as genres that were clearly offering like, people who had agency, who had leadership, who could differentiate, who could protect the weak and, catch the bad people, as part of that, desire to be a parole agent. So anyway, all that to say, I'm excited by, the work of abolitionists who are kind of creating these, imaginative narratives that are allowing people. I mean, we reference in the project sort of speculative fiction and the work of speculative fiction, that are really, kind of trying to move people's, all of our, I'm not, in isolation of that, it's also changing my thinking. Sort of these imaginative projects, whether it's N.K. Jemison's work or that are just speculative, that are allowing us to sort of rest in a different landscape where it's not about sort of bad people and good people, or that there's other possibilities to imagine flourishing life pathways that give people leadership and respect and dignity, right? Which is what I heard these two young folks, describing what they wanted, and I was like, well, I was like, you could be a public school teacher, and then I was thinking, like, they were looking at me like, are you crazy? Anyway, that was a long response.
No, but it has to do certainly with, I think, like the function of these representations as a kind of pedagogy, like, and I think about the campaign against shows like Live PD and Cops, these supposed reality shows that are really, and even the fact that we now have a term like propaganda to describe the police pedagogy in those shows, like that, there is movement against the sort of indoctrination that carceral form of pop culture provides. And like, I'm thinking too about how, like, Angela in the documentary Visions of Abolition talks about like when she herself started calling herself a prison abolitionist. And she's talking about the wake of the Attica prison uprising primarily, which, she experienced sort of directly, but now we experience as a thing of the past, like highly filtered. And so like, I found that to be a really extraordinary moment, and it's like one that you kind of underscore in abolition feminism now, that there's a real urgency to remembering those radical events in a kind of unfiltered way, and there is like, in particular, this idea, I think, that there's a counter-hegemonic force to just vividly remembering those moments. And like Attica is especially important. I wondered if you had noticed, like, there is a sudden interest in accessing that specific moment in the history of the United States violence against its prison population. Like last year, HBO released a documentary simply titled Attica.
Yeah.
That has this visual evidence that had been lost and presumed destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, Frank Big Black Smith and Jared Reinmuth
Mm-hmm.
published this critically acclaimed graphic novel, Big Black Stand at Attica, last year, which Angela is depicted in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, like, if your book, as it, you know, it's pointing out that there is this like I'm quoting it now, like an amalgam of economic, political, cultural, and representational forces that produces the fatal normal that we inhabit. And it sounds like both of you sort of feel like some of these texts, like Gina, this is something that I heard you saying, like some of these texts do offer another example that, you know, maybe counters you know, that fatal normal. And it's coming at a particular moment too, right? Like you wrote the book before what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls the murder by torture of George Floyd,
Mm-hmm.
and the explosion of activism. In the book, you say like mobilizations like this are often precipitated by violent death.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean, like, there is a way in which these images radicalize people. I don't know, as I don't know how to ask this question exactly. Like, I wonder if you can imagine how abolitionists could somehow be, as it were, like less reactive or something. Like, I interviewed Natasha Leonard for the podcast, and this was one of the points she made, that it's deeply flawed, both morally and politically, to sort of mobilize only when we're moved by the spectacle of, as she puts it, more black and brown death. And since the book is, as I said, like a kind of temporality of transformation book, like it's about these topics, I was hoping
Mm-hmm.
you could maybe speak to this sense that you convey, that the now is propelled by recent uprisings, that, you know, our sense of the present is informed differently today than it has been. Like, there's a kind of almost cognitive dissonance or something where, you know, there is slow work in urgent times that must be done, that both and thing. How do we stay present to that notion of the present, which is so elusive in a way?
Well, I think of this as really being about the fact that this book is written from the viewpoint of people who were not just provoked by the death of George Floyd or any others of the last period. Certainly the activism and the scholarship and other things that we're documenting have consistently been produced, and people have been thinking through these questions, working through these questions, working in local communities, working toward mutual aid, working in transformative justice, restorative justice. So it isn't so much about a different kind of experience for those of us who've been inside the movement. It's about the opportunity to widen that circle to include some who might have learned more about things as a result of the exposure of some of these recent cases. But it's also to invite those who've been awakened by that to join a community that has always existed, and to begin to live in the multiple times, the multiple temporalities that are required in order to do abolitionist work. I mean, I referred earlier to the joy that we've experienced, but also the pain that we're constantly confronting and the violence that our movements are always engaged with. And in order to do that work, to sustain it over generations, to think about what it means to date this phase of this movement to Attica, means that we are really talking about the slow work that has been engaged in. We are looking at what people have been consistently doing. We're looking at ways of conceptualizing this moment that people had been preparing for, which is why when people on the Minneapolis City Council, despite what we might consider the failure of the attempt at radical transformation there, knew how to speak to this moment of defunding the police. It wasn't as if they were just saying slogans. They had very specific um, activities that they were going to engage in, very specific ways of redirecting funds, very specific ways of thinking about how to make the community healthier, very specific ways of thinking about education as a something that we've fundamentally abandoned in this country intentionally, because that education started to be threatening
Mm-hmm.
to the elites. And so I think of this as something where we are inviting people to experience the joy of doing this work, of being in this other temporality, while we simultaneously attend to all of the emergencies that are continuing. But we can't live through those emergencies, and we can't learn in the space of emergency to do something which would require us to entirely reconceptualize what we have been engaged in previously.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's this idea, to quote the book, like we're all still reeling. I think you're speaking to yourselves as authors from the sense that historical time has fast forwarded, like
Yes.
that's that feeling of emergency and not being able to even think. Erica, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the sort of, to add to Gina's point, to the sort of feminist labor of like the abolition feminists now. What does it mean to sort of center the feminist labor that has been and continues to unfold, kind of regardless of what's in, what mainstream media is paying attention to, that kind of does this knitting together of a particular kind of ecology. So I think that, we felt like it was important to at least nod to the CC McDonald campaign, right, that unfolded in Minneapolis, prior to the mobilizations that erupted after the murder of George Floyd, in part because that campaign around CC McDonald was, was vibrant and passionate, largely spearheaded by young folks, queer folks, folks of color, and didn't, didn't sort of label itself feminist, but did sort of the hard, slow work of trying to get, support for CC,
Mm-hmm.
trying to all kinds of stuff. So I think the project, the book project, is trying to offer also a window on this this kind of consistent, persistent unfolding of feminist labor that of course is paying attention to headlines, but it's also doing the work anyway. And I think that felt important to us because that ecosystem, that strata of labor, is sort of is it doesn't often, just to echo back to a comment that Gina made, I think in relation to the first question, doesn't get a lot of attention. People don't pay attention to it. And it often dissipates. Like there's not a lot of record of that work, but that work we felt was really important to amplify.
Yeah, and it's something that I am still like processing, is this insistence on abolitionism that is feminist, feminism that is abolitionist, like, and trying to weave those together without prioritizing one or the other, and that's to not diminish the impact, as you're sort of saying, like, of the carceral system on women who are perhaps not locked up in the same numbers, but who bear the kind of brunt of all of the care labor required to keep the system running, all of this unremunerated care labor. The book, though, I wanted to maybe, I guess, pick up on that kind of question of like the politics of language to some extent, like using these terms. Sarah Ahmed, in her book What's the Use, she talks about these terms being used because they are used and then being sort of exhausted in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Gina, you talked about during the book launch the radical elements of a message can fall away or fall out, as you put it, or get omitted when ideas are made mainstream. Erica, in your research, you talk about these metaphors, how they too can get kind of like flimsy and brittle, like notions of like a pipeline or a railway. And I guess I started thinking about the bind that you must find yourselves in as theorists of these struggles. You recognize in the book that language is a central dimension of radical political movements. Words like prison industrial complex or propaganda can provide that explanatory power when it's just like we're just surrounded by static. But there is also that risk of something falling away. And so I guess just basically, what sorts of things happen in your mind when terms ossify, or what's lost and gained when like metaphors themselves gain a certain level of purchase in the mainstream?
I really think that this is, I mean, I should say maybe that I'm a literature PhD. I spent a lot of time
Mm,
thinking about language, thinking about shifts in language, and also the working at language. And this is really not unique. I think we see the book also as doing some of the work of treating the term abolition feminism as a term that you don't need, but you could use to gather work under, and you could use to make sure that you do, as we quote Mari Matsuda, always ask the other question. Uh,
mm,
Erica has been emphasizing the both and of the way we are thinking, and this is really consistent with our approach to all of these terms. I mean, anyone who's been involved in prison abolition for a long time understands that the generation of the idea of the prison industrial complex as something that we should try to think through has always been challenged by the fact that most people imaginatively think of the prison industrial complex as the buildings that are housing people who are currently incarcerated. And
sure, yeah.
instead, we're always having to do the work of talking about racial capitalism, of understanding the various ways in which something being labeled an industrial complex suggests that we need to think about all of the interconnected forms of relationality that are sustaining what we call the prison. And for us, abolition feminism also requires explanation. It isn't a given. It isn't even a given for us. I mean, even in writing, as we suggested, we all had a sense of how we would respond when someone else didn't ask the other question. But
Hmm.
it was a much different thing to try to say and to delineate and to cordon off an arena that we would say this itself is abolition feminism, partly because you can hear we have a feminist reluctance to that modality of expertise where we are the ones who are declaring from above what things are. So the book has that tension between um, welcoming in all the various kinds of labor and joyful practice that are in our minds part of abolition feminist work, and we also are freely acknowledging that we do not see everything. We have forgotten so much, as Erica started talking about, including the work by our friends and even our own work. So that that playing in the tension of how we think about these terms is really important. I have to say that I'm not a user of social media really. I passively consume it as I need to, but I do find the sound bites of Twitter and the Instagram posts and the hashtags somewhat difficult to operate with, given the kind of person that I am and the ways that I think about language. It's why I love to teach, and it's why a book like this being shared with the world is an opportunity to have the longer conversations and to encourage others to have those long conversations, which are not dependent on any of the four of us. And that is what I think we need to always insist, that these ideas are always more complicated, that sometimes people use them as branding exercises, and that is not really for us what is of primary importance, but instead it is really about the constant working at language and working at our thinking so that we can ourselves always be made anew in every moment.
Yeah, and I know Erica, like you have this article, "Ending the School to Prison Pipeline: Building Abolitionist Futures," where you talk about this exchange that you had with I think an incarcerated person at Stateville Prison in Illinois, and he sums things up by saying, "Oh, so you're making a living being an expert about my situation."
Yeah.
And there's this like that tension in the essay where like you're trying to avow the fact that you try to sort of deny any association with the label, that branding that experts give themselves. But at the same time, you say that, quote, you can be an expert on the United States commitment to incarceration. And I'm wondering sort of what it feels like to both deny an association with the capital, in a sense, that comes with being an expert, while at the same time trying to operate with this feeling that you have a certain maybe responsibility in this space to just share your expertise. Is it, for you about just trying to avoid a certain paternalism, or I think you call it in the book a kind of charity syndrome, that thing of just trying to modulate it so that you cannot invoke this authority without trying to, I don't know, I don't want to say embed yourself, but empathize perhaps.
Okay, wow, great question again. Let's see. At the tail end of what Gina was saying earlier. I was just sort of thinking through the importance of complex ideas and opportunities to have longer, thoughtful engagements. And I feel like we started this project when abolition was before the uprising and the organizing connected to summer 2020. And I think that one of the sort of realities that moved into the project was having, opening up space for more complex and different kinds of engagements with abolition, given that how abolition was moving into left organizing spaces had changed, right, from when we started the project to now. So I wanted to add that. And then this your second question, I think you're asking sort of how do we negotiate Gina has this great phrase, which I have liked to use, sort of the tendency in university spaces towards acquisitive individualism, maybe. I think that's
Sure, yeah.
and how do we reject that? How do we negotiate that? And I certainly don't have a prescriptive or quick response to that. I mean, my strategy has been to develop lines of accountability with organizations and movements and networks and people who can check you, who can ask for things, who can who can be present and work to hold you accountable. I mean, I think on the flip side, if I'm tracking the question, trying to be, I can also use my form of acquisitive individualism. I can write, authoritative letters, for people who are trying to get parole, and use my title and my university letterhead, such as it is, to do that. Right? I can agree to be grant evaluators for innumerable community projects, where they need somebody with a PhD after their name. So I think it's kind of, it's it's a messy move. How do we negotiate that? Because I certainly don't want to disinhabit the kind of resources that are attached to my paid day job. I think that those can be and are essential to creating the world that we know that we need. But I'm not silly enough to realize that those are the only things that I can offer, and that the knowledge produced from those spaces. And I think that our project is trying to remind readers that where knowledge comes from, where social movements come from.
No, yeah, that's fantastic, and it immediately makes me think about like Patricia Hill Collins' essay on Black feminist epistemology, where she talks about how like the issue with academia is it is this adversarial almost marketplace for ideas. But then to jump off of the second point, like, John Holloway has that book, Change the World Without Taking Power. And it's like, that's all well and good. But there's also this undeniable sort of obsession with like winning that you also take up in the book. And like this obsession with structural change as sort of a measure for whether to what extent a movement has won, has broken through and sort of gotten a win. And sort of like that's different from what you're advocating, which is about like the struggle to turn justice into like an experiment in care and redemption almost. And like, and trying to balance the both and like the structural change work and this like pursuit of reform at the same time. But like, to kind of frame it maybe more clearly, like I've been obsessing over this documentary series from PBS called Philly DA that's about the rise of like Larry Krasner to district attorney in Philadelphia. And there's this like remarkable moment in that series where an anti-incarceration activist explains that the Movement Alliance Project specifically did not take an abolitionist position when Krasner took office because they saw an opportunity to win with him in power. And like in Philly DA more broadly, like there is this conflict over, the use of data to convince the public that these at least reforms are worth doing. And like data-driven reforms, it shows over and over again, are a strangely hard sell in Philadelphia.
Yes.
Because they have to compete with the Fraternal Order of Police that is, buying billboards and trying to appeal to these like gut instincts about the role of police in protecting the public. I guess like, how do you feel about this bind of having to still deal with the binary nature of like winning and losing, waging an ideological war at the level of PR when you are clearly up against these like entrenched, well-funded institutions? Like, do you feel like the point is to radically change the narrative as broadly as possible in order to win? Is data like an answer, really? I mean, do we stay true to like insurgent ideas and the emergence of like new structures of feeling? Those seem intangible, but they also seem somehow more liberatory or something. And I didn't direct that to anyone, sorry.
Yeah. So much there. I mean, I feel like Erica always has such beautiful things to say about the ostensible failures. So I'd love to hear that. I'll just say briefly that I think that we can't have it one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this is why we're really attached to this both, and why we see this as the part of the argument why abolitionist work without feminist engagement is problematic. It's really that feminist component that doesn't assume you can leapfrog over the problems in front of you. It doesn't assume that you can just envision abolition all day and not care for all of those friends, loved ones, and others we don't know who are currently behind walls and bars. And it sounds simple. It's actually not simple to do both things. It's really important. Erica was raising earlier, you raised from her book, the story about those people who become, guards and others. We need to have some understanding of how that happens and some openness to assisting people to make a different kind of world with us. And if we're not welcoming of people who have been doing things very differently, then we really won't be able to change.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's only about mainstreaming, certainly. And I do know that the people who have labeled themselves abolitionists will often not be able to touch a lot of the structured reform work in the ways we might like. But I I really see, and I think we all saw when we witnessed the reaction to George Floyd's murder, it wasn't just the excruciating video, it wasn't just the exhaustion, it wasn't just the pandemic, it was also the preparation that has gone into these years of getting us ready. And so that is a culture change. It's slow work and it's going to be fragile work, but it is something that we can do.
You know, the last question, it's the question of the local, in a sense, and there is this kind of dedication in the book to the politics of sort of local struggles. Erica, you know, you've spoken a lot about the context of Chicago specifically. In Halifax, where I teach, where as you mentioned, 41% of the population was released, there is a vocal movement to defund and detask the police, and you know, we've seen what you sort of write about in the book made manifest. Like, you talk about how the major difference between anti-police activism of previous eras and the contemporary era of Black Lives Matter is that the kind of analysis in the movement is more deeply structural, and the solutions are more radical, more radically imaginative as a result. And this movement then to defund and detask and eventually dismantle policing, sadly but not unexpectedly, just took a hit recently in Halifax, where the city voted to approve a $2 million budget increase to the Halifax Police Department, in spite of the publication of a major report entitled "Defunding the Police: Defining the Way Forward for HRM." It feels like a loss, but I know that, like Elle Jones, who has just written an article for the Halifax Examiner on this failed opportunity, and the other authors of that report and all of the activists that they represent are not going to relent. And I guess I just wanted to ask, like, is there anything you would like to say to organizers maybe in this city about either how to go about maintaining momentum, or just any lessons you've learned from organizing, from writing the book, or just being a caring person in the world right now?
I mean, I kind of want to say just sort of huzzah on the report, yay, and just excitement for the labor and the focus for producing, that brilliant analysis and doing the work. And just, I mean, one of the interventions that we hope the book project makes is sort of creating, we talked a little bit earlier about sort of an ecosystem, like creating connections. Like, we see our work here in Chicago as connected to what's unfolding, in Halifax, very similar sort of retrenchment, pushback. But I also think we want to acknowledge sort of the successes of the work that we had, conversations, and we are having live conversations about, defunding the police in mainstream spaces, that the police budget, is under scrutiny, is people are paying attention to policing as a budget, rather than just giving it the consistent 2% or whatever raise. So I know that those are a little bit hollow, or perhaps can be interpreted as sort of hollow responses to the moment, the loss of the Halifax budget getting an extra $2 million. And I think that we can't lose sight of that. Like, of course that matters, that is, infuriating, that is, frustrating. But I think at the same time, we also want to hold the win, of the political education that report did, the intervention that report did, and kind of, bringing more people onto our team. I've been talking about the example of the brilliant No Cop Academy campaign here in Chicago that, sadly, we're probably going to get another $95 million police training academy in Chicago, but we're still going to be struggling and pushing back on that, and fighting against that. And one of the successes of that multi-year campaign is that over 100 organizations that, even 2 years earlier would never have signed on to a campaign that was demanding a reduction in a policing budget, engaged in political education, signed on, believe, and see themselves as, yes, like, we can imagine and define safety outside of expanding our policing budget. So a couple of, just coming back to, a couple of the responses I would have is, we see our work, in Chicago as connected to the work that's unfolding, in Halifax, in Brisbane, in the UK, in Johannesburg, in Sao Paulo, in Oakland. I mean, the project is, really reminding us of these interconnections, and also reminding us that we have to, just to echo Gina's earlier point, hold these two things as true at the same time, that's an enormous loss, the additional money to the budget, and we need to continue to struggle. And we have also, won changes in political discourse, in how people are thinking about policing, in kind of the political sensibility around policing. And we have to see ourselves as doing that for the long haul.
That's so important. And Gina, I suppose I'll give the last word to you, but I want to thank you both for making the time again. It's been so wonderful talking to you both.
Well, thank you. I'll just say that successes like the ones we've been talking about, or failures, sometimes they're both. I think of our local Stop Urban Shield campaign that succeeded in removing the militarized training from police forces in the Bay. And that was really important. But I also think that we should be focusing on something that Angela refers to as unlikely coalitions, which is something we try to lift up in the book, which are really looking at ways that we can bring people into this movement from where they are. And one group of people that we're really engaged with are people who've been doing anti-domestic violence work, mm-hmm. and have mm-hmm. had to learn the very difficult way mm-hmm. about how much policing does not serve their cause. And so it isn't hopefully going to always be about reforming and spending more and more money on police departments. And at some point, I think we will know that. I think we won't know that, however, just from data or reports. The reason we spent time talking about our popular cultural environment, and the reason we need to talk about racial capitalism, and the reason we need to talk about power, is that we really need to understand what we're facing. We can't just, try to show people how damaging police and prisons are and have been. We have to do more to encourage the kinds of complex thinking and imagination that allow people to start to invest in other forms of safety, security, and joy.
Yeah, wow. Again, thank you so much. There's, of course, a million more things I want to ask you, but you've been so generous with your time, and I can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much for having us. Really appreciate the conversation.
Yes, thank you.